Yeah, the subtitle that I sent to you was a parasitology. I haven't put it on this slide, but it definitely is a parasitology. I can say something about that. Well, I can just start actually, and it's part also of this first quote that I find hugely interesting. So it's a quote from the book Fathers, the first one of 7 books by Knausgaard, and it starts interestingly with the death of the father. And this is the quote. Sorry, I'm kind of trying to get rid of something here on my screen. The enormous hurdles of bacteria that begin to spread through the body's innards cannot be halted. Had they tried only a few hours earlier, they would have met with immediate resistance. But now everything around them is still, as they delve deeper and deeper into the moist darkness. I think that's a really intriguing start of 7 beautiful books, by the way, but also intriguing idea. So how the body of the father is immediately after his death taken over by hordes of bacteria, and become part of other bodies, because that's of course what this is all about. As said, I find it an intriguing idea because it shows us something of a type of power which we have not had too much attention for. I mean, we're all Marxists in a way, and we're all interested in masters and slaves and the way they relate to one another. But there are definitely other forms of power, and maybe even more important forms of power. And the French thinker Michel Serres, I'm a big fan of him. Sorry for the but once I wrote a book, and now I'll shut up about my work. Once wrote a book, also with an interview of him, where he talks a lot about this. Michel Serres is a wonderful thinker, also interesting historical works, by the way, on Rome, where he also talks about the plague. But he also has a very good book called The Parasite. And there he talks of the parasite and the relation between the parasite and the host. And the interesting thing is that contrary to how we normally read power relations in Marx, with the parasite, things work differently. The parasite is, of course, smaller than the host. It's usually actually it's tiny, even invisible in many ways. At the same time, the parasite somehow finds a way to continue to eat from the host. And even more remarkable is that the host continues to give until its death. And Sarah also gives a few examples of a parasite-host relationship where the host actually loves giving itself to the parasite. I like the idea of loving in that sense. So this is a power relation which I guess, well, that's also what Sarah writes about a lot, happens all around us in many ways. So many different forms of parasite-host relationships. And for some reason, we have had little attention to it. And that mainly comes because we do not recognize this relationship. There are people who write about ecology and the ecological crises, also in terms of parasites and hosts. And then we are the parasites, meaning humans, and the world is the host. For some reason, the world continues to give us endlessly foods and whatever we need. And we gladly use it, and we want more and more up until the host dies. And yeah, for some reason, we don't see this as a power relation, or at least we don't recognize the whole, the parasitical idea in it. Anyway, that's just a starting point for me to talk about society / the city, and the way this has changed, I think, radically during the pandemic. So the title is While You Were at Home Confined, Control and Technology After the City. So I play with the word after here. So the question is whether we are after the city, whether the city has stopped existing, or whether we have to understand a new form of technology and control in relation to the city. Something has changed there. Of course, it has to do with parasitical relationship. I start in this first page also, as you can see, with 3 photos, which I took next to my house, actually. The first one I took right after so in April 2020, as you can see. The interesting thing was that, these columns, and they, of course, Rotterdam is a prosperous city in a way. So we have these columns everywhere about the cultural events. And of course, these are cultural events that have yet to take place. But as you can see, this was taken in April 2020. You can almost not see it, but the theater play that they're advertising took place in March, so already a month ago, from the moment this photo was taken. So that was actually the situation, I'm sure also in London and in Birmingham and wherever you live, that all of a sudden these kind of very obvious systems of communication during the pandemic immediately stopped. These billboards are expensive, so people put their signs on it and have to pay for it. And the moment that this theater piece is over, then a new advertisement follows. So in that sense, they have a quite interesting role in how the city works and how communication works. And they announce what is coming, and we all know that, and we never doubt. I mean, we are surprised whenever there's 1 or 2 days, at least in Rotterdam, gone after and the sign is still there. So the fact that this was already more than a month ago was, at least I never saw that in my life. The second column, as you can see, the second photo of this column is taken in June. And then there was just a sign saying no more concerts. And in the hashtag below that, you can hardly read it, it says das gut, which is very much slang, not very nice language, saying, yeah, that sucks, something like that. In January, the next year, so almost a year further, there's a sign saying, Rotown loves you. Rotown is again slang for Rotterdam. I thought this was an interesting way of a micropolitics, showing how the city itself has been in trouble with the quarantine, with the pandemic. So here's a few statements that I wanted to share with you. The posters were not taken into a new context, nor were they in any other way framed to tickle the imagination. Hence, they were simply not included in the urban fabric in which they made sense before. So somehow something happened where, and this is the pandemic, of course, where these systems of communication that kind of bring the city together, and this is a small example, of course, but I liked it, and I had nothing better to do than take some pictures of what happened in the streets around me. And I like micro politics in that sense. So not always the talking about what happens in governments and all that, but just to look at what happens in a city when things like these take place. And I think just looking at how these columns did not function anymore has a lot to say about what happened in a city, or at least it signals what happens in a city. And in that sense, they reminded me of how the different elements of the body of the father of Karl Ove Knausgaard at one moment also all of a sudden didn't function anymore. Remember the quote that I started with, where bacteria all of a sudden took over, like, and then he says, like 15 minutes before his death, these bacteria wouldn't stand a chance. But at the moment someone dies, all of a sudden the defense system falls away, and then the different elements are taken up by other forms of life, or something happens with them. At least the unity that was once so important for this particular body, the body of the father or the city in that sense, this unity fell apart overnight. Now this study that I did, I published about this also in a book that already came out, but I'm working on it. This is a book that came out, the post-human pandemic. I wrote a chapter in it, which follows the line of this talk in general, but I'm changing it a bit because I'm writing a book actually for myself on the city, on the post-human city, or at least the non-human city, or all the different elements of the city. I'm trying to understand how a city works apart from its human inhabitants, and of course very much on the contemporary. I'm not a historian, so I am interested in how, especially nowadays, the idea of the city is in change. And I think the pandemic in that sense messed things up badly, actually. But anyway, it reminded me again of a book of Michel Serres, which is called Thumbelina in English, where he talks a lot about how our lives are run by 19th century institutions. And he gives all kinds of examples that we are familiar with, perhaps, but somehow we don't realize how this adds up. So he talks, this was written in 2014. He passed away a few years back, unfortunately. Back then he was already in his 80s. So he talks a lot in his books, also in a book like Thumbelina, about how he grew up in the Garonne River at the start of the 20th century, and how he remembers his grandparents, and how his grandchildren lead such a completely different life compared to his grandparents. Yet somehow the institutions that we work with, for instance, the nation state, are still very much given form through 19th century politics. So Michel Serres is interested in how his grandchildren, the millennials, how they live in a society which somehow is run through institutions. And he compares that actually with the stars on the sun, the stars that you see at night that have been that you navigate with, but that have been dead for 10,000 years. He says that's more or less the situation that we find ourselves in now too. We live in a world with 8 billion inhabitants and not 1 billion, which was the case in 1900. People grow up in the city, not on the countryside. They never seen a cow or a calf. That's what, at least how he frames it. The way in which they live their life is completely different from how this happened in the early 20th century. And yet these institutions still exist. So all of our ideas also on what a city is and how a city should be governed is still very much 19th century, is his claim at least. So I'm interested in these institutions. And of course, I mean, for the book that I'm writing, and also for this particular narrative that I'm interested in, what follows from the pandemic, I'm interested in how these institutions somehow stop functioning and how they give rise to something else. And another important thinker in my work is Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze also wrote a lot about how 19th century institutions run our society, yet he says, without us noticing it, after World War II, quite some things have changed. And I guess some of this we notice. I mean, we're not completely crazy, of course, but still, the consequences of it are difficult to oversee. And he comes up with the term, the societies of control. So he was a close friend of Michel Foucault. And he is more or less agreeing with what Foucault says about how the disciplinary society was organized in the 19th century, and how these institutions of the 19th century, and like our idea of a school and of law and the barracks and the army, the madhouse, the hospital, you name it, how they kind of built the modern city. At the same time, he says that after World War II, we see that these sites of confinement, as he calls them, all of these different institutions function as sites of confinement. For instance, in school, kids go into school. In this school, there's a particular system, and they have to learn and behave according to the laws of the school, so that in the end they can go back to society again and probably be taken up into another site of confinement, which is work. If you behave badly, you go to a prison. If you are ill, you go to a hospital. But still, these are sites of confinement, Deleuze says. What you see in societies of control, which is then the situation after 1945, is that slowly but gradually, these sites of confinement cease to exist. In fact, they break open, and especially, of course, with the coming of the internet. This text was written actually in 1990, so before the internet came into existence. But still, there's so much in it that says actually exactly what our society now looks like. It's quite prolific in that sense. But these sites of confinement turn into a society of control, which means that all these different systems of control, system of disciplining, they get entangled into one another, and they turn into free-floating forms of control, as Deleuze puts it. Now, as we read Foucault, we can already see that the sites of confinement come with a very strong material kind of basis, right? So, for instance, the coming of the prison. He gives the example of the panopticon, has had a major effect, not just on how we think about imprisonment, but also on what a prison looks like. And the same goes for schools, of course, and for hospitals. I mean, the architecture of these places is strongly entangled with the ideas that they want to that they work with. So Deleuze says that the disciplinary society works with a very strict geometry. The societies of control work with a different geometry. They are equally materialists in that sense. So they are not, the societies of control are not just just like the internet is not just something out there. It actually exists. It's a thing. These are the big black boxes that we find in empty fields, and these are the cables that run into your house, and these are the screens that you look at, and the keyboards that your fingers are attached to. It's very much a thing. Deleuze says that these geometries of the societies of control are slowly but gradually taking over the geometries of what used to be known as the disciplinary society, which is actually what we see in all the cities that we too live in. That the old hospitals and the old courthouses and the old hospitals and the old barracks, they're all taken over by us. I mean, they turned into apartments, very expensive. And this new geometry of the society of control, for instance, the internet. But of course, this also has a lot to do with a lot more kind of the networking of society. Also in the material sense, takes over these areas. So even when you look at these 19th century institutes, Deleuze already announces they're all finished. Banking as a separate institute is finished. Of course, the army is finished. We're all completely surprised that there's actually a war in Europe. Who would have guessed that that could even take place in 2022? And we'll find out that all of a sudden we don't even have an army anymore. We're called the NATO, but there's nothing left. Anyway, so these are, for Deleuze, very interesting kind of shifts that are going on, and that in a Sarian way, we haven't really noticed. We still think that society functions according to these very strictly organized institutes, these sites of confinement, as he calls them. But in the end, all is connected to all, and the moment, well, of course, when you get in the hospital, your insurance company knows, but nowadays also your employer knows, and your employer in 10 years will know, and the bank that pays for your house will know. So there's definitely not the kind of separation anymore, which is how things started in the 19th century when it comes to these institutes. So what I find intriguing find intriguing is that Deleuze calls it that these sites of confinement turn into some kind of a network, or sometimes the coils of a snake, as he once puts it, which is of course much more complex than the burrow of a mole, the site of confinement. But what does that mean for something like the panopticon? I suggest that the way to think about how society is nowadays interested in controlling us all is not so much through a panopticon, but through a panopticon inverted. So a panopticon, as you probably know, is all about the idea that in the 19th century prisons in Holland, we still have a few left. We put asylum seekers there too, by the way, sometimes, the ones that are still empty. But anyway, the panopticon there's one space in the middle, preferably covered with mirrors. There could be a guard in it, could also not be a guard in it. Surrounded by a ring of prisons, so that every prisoner has the idea, at least, that he's being watched constantly. So panopticon inverted would mean the exact opposite, that there's one person in the middle who is being viewed at from all the different prison cells, and all the different prison cells know exactly what this person is doing, which I think is happening to all of us. We can also call it a mobile phone, which might be an easier way of terming it. It means that with every step we take, and even if we don't take any steps, that there are an enormous amount of institutions watching us and calculating what our next step might be and how to respond to that possible next step. So it's quite quite a different system from the system that we have grown up in, and what the consequences of this are is of course almost impossible also to understand. I'll come back to my earlier case of the corpse, of course, of the father of Knausgaard, and of what this means for the city, of the columns that I started with. A very important column, a Neo-Foucauldian also, is Paul Preciado. Don't know if you heard of him. Used to be a her, now it's him. Paul Preciado writes a lot about body politics and about how this system of control, which was given form to in the 19th century, was in the end always about, and we can also read it in Foucault, of course, his last books were on the history of sexuality, where he also writes about the impact of power on the body politics. But Paul Preciado, of course, continues the work of Foucault by writing on how the 21st century kind of continues the body politics. And there we also see a similar move as what we see with Deleuze. There is some kind of a society of control at work in this body politics. So it's not just in the sites of confinement, which turn into a kind of a network, and I call it a panopticon inverted. For instance, the city, because of course that's what I will talk about in the end. But also on a very personal level, there's a kind of body politics in change, which is what Preciado in detail writes about. Maybe I should just quote this because it's actually well written also. In the domain of sexuality, the pharmacological modification of consciousness and behavior, the mass consumption of antidepressants and anxiolytics, and the globalization of the contraceptive pill, as well as antiretroviral therapies, preventative AIDS therapies, and Viagra, are some of the indicators of biotechnological management, which in turn synergizes with new modes of semi-technical management that have arisen with the surveillance state and the global expansion of the network into every facet of life. Intriguing idea, I think, and it's, I mean, we all know that maybe this is more pressing even in the United States, but I guess also in Europe, the way in which the pharmaceutical industry is kind of steering us, especially since the pandemic. Of course, we all had 2 or 3 jabs, or at least that was what the state told us to, is a fantastic example of how the body politics work and how this is, especially with the pandemic, turned into some kind of global system of repression, where every step you take, especially at the moment of lockdown and when there were 20 different stages where this lockdown was turned into the better situation that we are in now, but the moment that the whole of society was turned into a kind of an observatory and a very interesting kind of research site for what body politics can do. And I'm pretty sure that the state will not forget the lessons that they learned in the sense of how they could organize society differently. We'll see about that soon, I'm afraid. But anyway, the whole idea of how not just the disciplinary societies that Michel Foucault talks about, but definitely even more so, this society of control of Deleuze is in the end very much interested in a body politic. It tells us a lot about how in the end, during the pandemic, we've been taken over by this new society of control or system of repression. We have to see how it works out, of course, in the end. But I think that what these people are talking about, Michel Serres, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, and Paul Preciado, tell us a lot about how one system, and now I'm talking again about, for instance, the body of the father of the example that I gave in the beginning of the writer Knausgaard, how one system all of a sudden turns into something completely else, or is taken up into a series of other systems, parasitologically in the end. So in order to make this a bit clearer, I wanted to conceptualize this whole idea of the panopticon inverted in 3 steps. The first is pretty obvious, I guess. And the panopticon inverted is no longer in need of the system of confinement, which is, of course, how the 19th century kind of organized society. For the panopticon inverted, that is not needed anymore. Nowadays, we work through networks, and especially because of the internet and our mobile phones, this system has a much more continuous way of surveilling us and of taking actions upon our actions. The second thing is that the panopticon inverted is no longer in need of the human or of human language. There's many people in, for instance, they call it post-phenomenology. People like Mark Hansen writes a lot about this, Mark B.N. Hansen. He writes how contemporary media, and especially if you look at the stock market, for instance, are functioning completely outside of human control. We know that algorithms are usually important, of course, but these algorithms nowadays, and we saw that already in 2008, of course, with the financial crisis, and no one ever understood what happened back then. But all of our financial systems fell apart all of a sudden. For 15 minutes, it was complete chaos in the world, financially at least. No one noticed. But anyway, back then we already saw that this system is cannot be controlled anymore by humans, and the same goes for, of course, well, nowadays for everything that follows on our banking system. The banks trade in such high speed that there are, of course, people who somehow try to steer it, but they follow the ways in which these machines act upon one another within 1 millisecond, and it's just, as said, Mark Hansen is a good source for this, but he shows in he calls it Fast Forward, his last book. He shows how this system of control, this financial system, for instance, is not run by humans anymore. Which is, of course, also how my cell phone registers me. So how every step I take is registered and is sent to different firms, companies, national states. That is a system which is designed, of course, by humans, but there's not one single human being in the world able to stop this anymore. I'm saying also no longer in need of the human, and also no human language, because these computers, they don't even talk in language that is understandable for us anymore. Of course, this is machine talk, so we cannot even understand what they're talking about. If they want to say something which might be interesting for us, they have to translate machine language to a language or an image that we understand. But the communication itself is not taking place in a language that is made for us, actually. So the third consequence is, which is, of course, also what I am interested in, the panopticon inverted is no longer in need of a city, of the city. So if we look at Foucauldian societies, the whole idea of disciplining has actually a lot to do with how do you manage a crowd and how do you organize society in such a way that it is manageable. We talked about, for instance, schools and prisons and hospitals. And the whole idea of the city in that sense is, I think, quite linked to these 19th century institutes, because it's no coincidence that in every city there's a network of these institutes which kind of feeds it. I mean, we have to have schools in every area. We have to have a prison here and there. In the middle of the city, there is, of course, the townhouse, and there is all your well-known institutes. They kind of built the fabric of the city. Again, these are 19th century institutes. We know by now that quite a lot of these institutes are not functioning anymore. Our schools, for instance, at this moment, happen over the internet. When we want a new passport, we do at least 90% of what we have to do through the internet. And the same goes actually for everything that has to do with these particular institutes. So in the end, why do we need a city anymore? Why do we need to come together in this very 19th century way? I think that is a process that has been going on since 1945, but it has been speeding up dramatically during the pandemic. And we know this as people interested in education. We know that this happened through our universities and through our schools. But actually in all these sites of confinement, you see that people have turned towards the society of control. and that so many of the institutes that we still consider the fabric of the city are actually hardly functioning anymore. As I said, I'm very much influenced by the work of Gilles Deleuze and by this text called The Society of Control. He says a lot about how capitalism has changed, also during the 20th century already. Capitalism is not so much a system aimed at production anymore, but it is a capitalism of products. It buys activities, it sells services. It is aimed at sales and markets. And Deleuze adds to this that we all know that markets are interested in control. Actually, all of the big firms nowadays that run our economy are not so much interested in production anymore. The new industries, thinking of Booking.com, of Amazon, of course Facebook and Instagram, they are not so much interested in production. They are interested in controlling these markets. And of course, they, in that sense, learn a lot from you, from the information sources, not the money sources, but the information sources and the new networks of information sources, how they offer forms of growth. So at the end of this text, Postscriptal Control Society, Deleuze talks of his friend Félix Guattari, with whom he wrote several books. And Félix Guattari, again in the end of the 1980s already, said the following: Félix Guattari has imagined a town where anyone can leave their flat, their street, their neighborhood using their electronic card that opens this or that barrier. But the card may also be rejected on a particular day or between certain times of the day. It doesn't depend on the barrier, but on the computer that is making sure that. The whole idea that this is a card may remind us of a credit card, but I guess this is also what a mobile phone does. This is what nowadays, and all of these systems of control work with, and Deleuze also mentions this in the text, they work with passwords. They give you access to one new room, and then you can jump to another. And that is actually the kind of inverted panopticon through which also the education system is being rearranged. So we don't have a separate system of control anymore in which a student is kind of educated. We have endless series of exams through which one room gives you access to another room. And that's not just so in education, it's actually in all of these these former sites of confinement, that we work very much through a continuous form of control, where computers or algorithms decide, and not us, decide which room you're allowed to enter and which not. Yeah, I come back to the three photos that I used in the beginning, the columns. The first one said showed a concert that never happened. Even a month after it was supposed to happen, the column was still saying there's a concert happening in a few days. A few months later, it said the column said no more concerts. And a year later, it says Rotterdam loves you. Rotterdam loves you. In a way, especially the last one, sounded almost like a permanent goodbye of the city, in that its institutes had now been taken over by this new system of control, this new society of control, in which the older sites of confinement had no role anymore. So that is what I meant with a parasitology. The parasite in this sense is not so much us, but is the society of control, which without us knowing this and with us feeding it constantly and with us loving it. And once again, I'm referring to my mobile phone. We all love our mobile phones and we love our social networks and all the forms of information that we spread through it. And at the same time, it is killing us, or it is at least killing the kind of society we live in, meaning, for instance, the city, giving us in return something else. So the body ceases to exist, and what happens afterwards is still a mystery. But and we can still believe in the city, and we can still believe in the townhouse and in whatever sites of confinement we are familiar with. But in the end, they are like the stars that we see at night that populate the sky, but that have been dead for 10,000 of years already.